There's an island in New York City you cannot visit. Pull up satellite imagery right now and find it sitting in the East River between the South Bronx and Rikers Island, a rectangle of dense green forest roughly the size of 15 city blocks. Zoom in further, rooflines through the canopy, some of them collapsed, streets that used to run between buildings now completely overgrown, a crumbling seawall, something that might be a lighthouse, and then the whole thing disappears back under the leaves.
If you go to the South Bronx today, you can see it about 1,500 feet offshore. Most people who've grown up here have never thought that much about it. It's just the green island that's always sat there and always been off limits.
What's inside is a list of things New York City spent 80 years trying not to look at. A small brick cottage where the city locked up an Irish cook without a trial and kept her there for 26 years. A scorched stretch of waterfront where more than 1,000 people died in a single morning. A campus of wards where the city locked addicted teenagers in rooms and stopped asking questions about what happened to them. Then one day it all stopped. The staff locked the doors, walked to the dock, and got on the boats. Nobody came back. We're going to tell you each of these stories, but first, the reason you can't visit today. And that's because of what moved in after everyone else left.
North Brother Island's what's known as a forever wild preserve, one of only 51 sites across all 5 boroughs with that designation. It's prime habitat for the black-crowned night heron and a dozen other colonial wading birds.
South Brother is where the active heron colony lives today, but North Brother is the habitat the city is trying to keep ready, because for a stretch of years, the birds nested there too. The New York City Parks Department controls the access and rarely grants it to anyone. Even when they do, you have to be escorted on the island by city personnel. The reason? Human presence during nesting season, which runs from mid-March through August, causes colonial waders to abandon their nests. So from the perspective of New York City's Parks Department, this tiny part of New York City must remain free of people entirely. Black-crowned night herons are what ecologists call an indicator species. They feed at the top of the East River's aquatic food chain, bioaccumulating whatever moves through that water. PCBs, heavy metal, pesticide residue from a century of industrial New York. When a colony successfully raises chicks, their health is a living readout of the river beneath them.
The fact that they're nesting here at all says something about how far back the East River has come from the catastrophic pollution of the mid-20th century.
Susan Elbin, conservation director at NYC Audubon, described why the birds chose North Brother in the first place. The island had buildings and trees, which were structure for nesting, no people, and a whole river full of fish waiting to be eaten. They moved into the abandoned wards, they nested in the collapsed rooflines you can see from the satellite image. They built their colonies inside a place that used to hold human beings against their will.
Here is that story, and it starts not with the birds, but what's still standing on the south end of the island.
A small brick cottage, partially swallowed by vegetation, that was once someone's prison. The island had been a quarantine hospital since the 1880s. Smallpox, typhus, tuberculosis, diphtheria, anything contagious that the city wanted off of Manhattan. By 1907, it housed Riverside Hospital, a sprawling campus of wards and pavilions for the diseases the city couldn't cure and didn't want to see. And that year, it acquired a new patient. Her name was Mary Mallon. She was Irish, she was a cook, a genuinely skilled one, good enough to escape the grinding domestic labor most Irish immigrants were locked into. And in 1907, she became the first person in the United States identified as an asymptomatic carrier of Salmonella typhi, the bacterium that causes typhoid fever. She had no symptoms, she felt completely healthy, but a sanitary engineer named George Soper had traced a series of typhoid outbreaks in wealthy households back to a common factor. Mary had cooked in 7 of the 8 affected households before the cases appeared. When Soper showed up to explain this and ask for stool samples, Mary chased him out with a carving fork.
And that response was rational. A stranger was telling her that she had a disease she'd never had in an era before anyone had explained to the public what an asymptomatic carrier was.
She didn't believe him. She had no reason to. In March 1907, Dr. Sarah Josephine Baker arrived with 5 police officers. Mary hid in a neighbor's closet for 5 hours while they searched the building. Once they finally got her into the ambulance, Baker would later write that sitting on her on the ride to the hospital was, quote, like being in a cage with an angry lion. Her stool test came back positive. The city gave her that small brick cottage and told her she could not leave.
She filed a writ of habeas corpus, she wrote letters to newspapers, she paid for private lab test results that showed she was negative.
The New York American called her the most harmless and yet the most dangerous woman in America. She wrote to her lawyer, "I have been, in fact, a peep show for everybody."
In 1910, a court agreed quarantine was difficult to justify. There were hundreds of other typhoid carriers living freely in New York State. Mary was released on condition that she never work as a cook again.
She was a professional cook with no other marketable skill, so she eventually did what anyone in her position might do. She changed her name to Mary Brown and returned to the kitchens. In 1915, she was found working at a Manhattan maternity hospital where a typhoid outbreak had sickened 25 people and killed 2. She was arrested and returned to North Brother Island.
She remained on the island for the rest of her life. She suffered a stroke Christmas morning, 1932, and was found on the floor of her cottage. She spent her final years at the island's children's ward, a building that still stands today.
She died in 1938 at the age of 69. 9 people came to the funeral.
Here's the part that gets left out of textbooks. While Mary spent 26 years on that island, health authorities identified over 400 other asymptomatic typhoid carriers in New York. None was imprisoned for anything close to the same duration.
A carrier named Tony Labella caused, across 2 separate outbreaks, more than 120 confirmed cases and 5 deaths, a higher toll than anything attributed to Mary.
The city's response was to release him after a brief quarantine and help him find non-food work, and he's almost unknown to history.
Other carriers, like Frederick Morsch, a German-born confectioner who infected more people with typhoid than Mary, were eventually given help finding work outside food service, often with the city or state covering their rent. The historian Judith Walser Levitt documented what actually determined how these cases were handled. Her finding, public health authorities were more interested in proving their power than in helping Malin understand her situation or find a safe way to make a living.
The emerging field of epidemiology needed a compelling moral story. Mary was poor, female, an Irish immigrant, working in the kitchens of people far wealthier than she would ever be.
And she was traceable. She changed jobs frequently, leaving an epidemiological trail that ran through wealthy households with the resources to hire investigators. The New York City Health Department could forcibly detain anyone deemed a public health threat. No criminal charge, no trial, no end date. Mary once asked in a letter, "Why single out and imprison just me?"
Nobody ever answered that question, and her cottage is still there on the south end of the island, disappearing slowly into the vegetation.
But before Mary ever set foot on North Brother, the shoreline had already witnessed something the city had spent 3 years trying to forget. June 15, 1904, 3 years before Mary's arrest, 1,358 people, mostly women and children from St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church in the Manhattan neighborhood then called Little Germany, boarded a steamship called the General Slocum for their annual church picnic. The band was playing, children were running the deck, women were wearing their best Sunday dresses. They were headed up the East River toward Long Island Sound. 20 minutes in, fire broke out below deck. The hoses, untested in years, burst under pressure. The life preservers, rotted and deteriorating, disintegrated in people's hands when yanked from the wall. The captain kept the ship moving forward, feeding oxygen into the fire, and steered for the nearest safe landing he knew, North Brother Island. By the time the burning hull scraped against that rocky bank, it was an inferno. Nurses and patients from the quarantine hospital already operating on the island ran to the waterline.
They threw ropes, they pulled burning bodies from the river, some nurses dove in.
Within an hour, 150 bodies lay across the island's lawn on blankets. Most of them were women, and one was still holding her baby.
1,021 people died that morning, New York's deadliest disaster until September 11th. So many women and children died from the neighborhood of Little Germany in Manhattan that it effectively ceased to exist as a neighborhood.
The men who survived moved away, the churches dispersed, the cultural center of what had been one of the city's most vibrant ethnic enclaves dissolved within a few years. The island's lawn, the same lawn where the hospital staff had laid out the bodies, was mowed and maintained for decades afterward. It's still there. The seawall where the Slocum scraped to a stop is the crumbling structure visible in the satellite image on the island's southern edge. Vegetation has been reclaiming it for 60 years.
After World War II, the city tried to make North Brother into something different. The old hospital wards were converted into housing for veterans studying on the GI Bill.
A small community took shape, a few hundred families with a grocery, a library, a movie theater, ferries on a schedule. Children actually grew up there, and for a few years in the late 1940s, it looked like the island might finally become something ordinary.
Then in 1952, the city tried something that had never been attempted in America. It converted the entire island into a juvenile drug rehabilitation center for heroin-addicted teenagers. The theory was simple: put people somewhere where drugs were physically impossible to obtain.
The distance would cure the addiction. What actually happened, according to accounts compiled from staff and former patients, was that boyfriends paddled across the Hell Gate in rowboats at night to pass drugs through the windows. Orderlies smuggled heroin onto the ferry in exchange for cigarettes. Teenagers in withdrawal were locked in rooms with minimal supervision. The wards where patients had once recovered from tuberculosis now held children locked up for addiction, with almost no treatment and no meaningful path out. Recidivism rates were catastrophic. Most patients returned to using within months of release. The program ran for 11 years and shut down in 1963 amid corruption allegations the city never seemed eager to pursue.
Those wards are still standing on the island. The rooms are still there. Trees have grown through the foundation. Vines snake in through the window. Whatever happened in those rooms has been covered in 60 years of vegetation.
And after they left, finally, nobody came back.
What happened next is the part that photographer Christopher Payne documented when he was granted rare access between 2008 and 2013.
He described walking into the island's interior as arriving in a canopied forest, one where, if you had no idea what it used to be, you would assume had always been wild. Historic photographs showed manicured lawns, paved streets, flower beds, a functioning hospital campus. What Payne found was a forest. It took roughly 50 years. He said reading Alan Wiseman's The World Without Us, which imagines what Earth looks like after humans disappear, felt like reading captions for his own photographs. English ivy crept up the brick exteriors, kudzu sprawled over fences, sumac pushed through the cracked asphalt. Sugar maples took root in what used to be the hospital courtyards. The tuberculosis pavilion now rises above the tree canopy like something from a jungle, which it essentially is, a short ferry ride from LaGuardia Airport. The 25 original buildings are still there in what the Parks Department calls, quote, various states of extreme dilapidation. And into those buildings, into those courtyards, into those broken window frames above the East River, the herons came. For a stretch of years in the 1990s and early 2000s, the colony thrived. Then, by 2008, the vegetation had grown too dense even for them, the undergrowth too thick for their nesting preferences. The birds crossed the channel to South Brother and the other harbor heron sites and have been raising chicks there ever since. NYC Parks launched a reforestation program in 2012, planting native sumac, dogwood, and American holly, removing invasive species, and deliberately managing the landscape to keep North Brother viable in case the birds choose it again.
The city spent money grooming a forbidden island to attract birds, which means that the South Bronx, one of the most park-deprived communities in New York City, can look across the water at 30 acres of managed urban forest that they can't set foot on.
Stand on the South Bronx shoreline on a clear afternoon and look east. It's right there, a wall of green in the river, brick roof lines just visible above the canopy, the same roof lines from the satellite image, the same buildings that held quarantine patients, disaster victims, veterans, addicted teenagers, and one Irish cook who asked a question nobody ever answered. Just behind it, almost touching, is South Brother. Smaller, lower, treeless on top, no buildings. That's where the herons nest now. They cross the channel on summer evenings, low on the water, fishing the same river the Slocum burned on. They have no idea what happened on either island. They only know that their islands are quiet and the river is full and no one comes.
The city sent its problems to the island and then it locked the doors and took the boats away. And turns out if you wait long enough, nature will move back in.